Welcome to Life by Design, the podcast for chiropractors. Here's your host, Dr. Jamie Richards.
Welcome to Life by Design for chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic. I'm Dr. Jamie Richards. I'm your host. And on today's episode, we introduce you to one of my good friends, colleagues, and directors of Life by Design, Dr. Mike Gibson. And Mike and I spent some time today digging into a concept that is core to Life by Design called blind spots. One of those things that, if you don't know what you don't know, does it really hurt you? And the answer obviously is yes. And we spent some time going into 10 blind spots today. For most of us, we're all experiencing to some degree 1, 2, 3, or even more of these blind spots. So we gave you some overall highlights about what the blind spots are and how to at least work towards identifying them. Gave you some resources and some tools, and there's a free download there for you too that summarizes what those blind spots are. So welcome to Life by Design for chiropractors and enjoy today's episode. Guys, welcome to the show today. I'm really excited today for Life by Design for chiropractors. We've gone through a few great episodes so far. As you've listened in, we've had a special guest with us, Dr. Kreisho Jug, and today I get the pleasure of introducing another one of my good friends and colleagues and directors at Life by Design, someone that you're going to want to get to know very, very well on this episode and in future podcasts. So without further ado, Mike, welcome to Life by Design for chiropractors.
Thank you. Very excited for my first go-around on this podcast. I'm looking forward to just a lot of the topics and some discussions that you and I have had. I mean, some of the topics we've got planned, I think, are really going to be, super helpful for chiropractors out there. So I'm looking forward to the process.
I'm stoked. I'm very excited. This is, we've said this before, but this is a project we've been thinking of for a long time. It's been in the works. And, with the launch of the Life by Design for Chiropractors website and all the things that we've been working on, this is really just the cherry on top. And it's going to be our vehicle to bring really great, valuable content to all of the listeners on a very regular basis, digging into some of these topics that we've really left untouched for a long time. As those who've listened to the Life by Design approved podcast, it's very layperson directed. This is for chiropractors, and that's one of the things that we're really excited about this. So I'm going to talk a lot about Mike, I'm sure, as we go through the podcast and some of his areas of expertise, but I think the best way to start before we dig into today's topic is just let you get to know Mike a little bit, and he's very humble, so I'll probably have to fill in some of the gaps along the way here. But Mike, if you could, just tell our listeners a bit about your personal story.
Sure. I was lucky enough to go to Life University, and I got to go through all the turmoil of the CCE accreditation fund. So I went through that. I went through Life University, did both my chiropractic and actually did a master's degree while I was there as well. Came back to my hometown, which is Canada, Ontario, a suburb of Ottawa. And I was really fortunate. I worked really hard to really grow my practice very quickly, and I had much early success. And I always joke that I definitely had that fat cat syndrome early in practice. It was, I was young. I had more money than at the time I needed. And practice really turned into a job for me, and it was something that I just got up in the morning. I went and did my thing, and I came home, and that's kind of the end. I didn't think about it much, and so it was really, as I said, it was really just a job for me. And then, unfortunately, something very, very tragic happened, and it really changed everything. My sister, my younger sister, who at the time was only 25 years old, she was diagnosed with leukemia. And after a very long, hard-fought battle, at 29 years of age, she passed. And as you can imagine, a tremendous amount of lessons were learned. And, one of the biggest things I learned is that I had, really accepted a lot of health information about things I should be doing to create health in my life, very dogmatically, from teachers and friends and whomever else. And so there was a lot of hard questions I had to ask myself, a lot of soul searching, really sent me down this path of doing a tremendous amount of research to really, figure out what was really true about health. What did we really know? What had I taken dogmatically? And really, the outcome I wanted to create was, trying to figure out how do I avoid this fate for myself and just not have to go through the struggles and, of course, have my life end so prematurely like my sister's. And then, of course, as I had kids and that desire to really figure all that health stuff out, really became even more entrenched. And my urgency really increased, and just trying to figure out how I could live the best and most healthy life, how I could, share that knowledge with my kids and make sure they could live that life, and the people in my community and in my practice. And so my sense of urgency around practice totally changed, and I totally, just dove in at a whole new level with a completely new purpose and vision. And well, that's kind of took me down this path, whereas today, of course, I'm one of the directors and owners of Life by Design. I own a CrossFit gym here in my hometown, also with Bonfire Fish Oil, and of course, just my own practice, which has really evolved and grown. And we now have 4 docs that are in practice there. So try to keep busy. 2 awesome kids, 2 young boys, 4 and 7 years old. So I spend most of my weekends here up north, of course, in hockey rinks. And you may hear throughout this episode our little puppy who is yapping away downstairs, saying, "I can hear you. Let me out." But yeah, that's really what keeps me busy.
And as my introduction to Mike, only 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, that for my own practice, things really started to blossom. And so that leads us to what today's topic is. And it's one of the core topics at Life by Design, and this is a concept called blind spots. We've talked in the past about requirements and strategies and some of these other core concepts, but really this is something that's developed in the last 12 months, but has really become a core idea with the company and something we want to acquaint you with today. And so just really short, my story, you've heard it before on different podcasts, but had great practice from a communication and passion standpoint. It wasn't so great from a systems standpoint, a team standpoint, and developing some of those ideas. We had grown a nice practice, up to 380 visits a week, and things were going great. And then we plateaued, couldn't figure out why. And in discussing things with Mike, I started to realize that maybe there were some areas that we didn't know that we didn't really know about, and those we deemed as these blind spots. And that was a concept that we came up with together, and realized that, man, there's a few areas that I never even realized were a huge problem. We'll talk about how you can figure those out and what those are today. But the point is, once I figured out the blind spots and corrected them, we grew another 110, 120 visits a week, and really just everything really exploded. And it wasn't that we didn't have the vast majority of things in place. It was that there was a very key component that was missing, and we didn't know what it was. And in my case, it was systems. That was the big thing, and it was a huge blind spot for us. So what we want to talk about in today's episode is this idea of a blind spot. So, what is a blind spot? It's an area of your practice or your business or even your life, and these can exist beyond chiropractic, that exists, but here's the key: you don't know it. You can't see it. And here's why it's important. And Mike, maybe you can comment on this, but it's important because it's still there. So even though you don't see it or recognize it, it's real. Mike, you talk a bit about this idea. I know we talk a lot about reality exists. How does this apply to the concept of blind spots?
Well, I think that's just it, is that, just because we don't recognize that there's a specific problem happening in our business or our practice does not mean that it doesn't exist and that it's not harming us.
Right.
We have to live consciously. We have to understand that reality exists, and we have to actually, be conscious and aware of these things. We can't choose not to address them. We have to address them. We have to go through the process of trying to figure out what they actually are, and then it doesn't stop there. You actually have to then, implement different and new strategies to overcome them. So, just because you don't know there's a problem in your practice does not mean that it's not hurting you and harming you and stopping you from actually growing your practice to where you want it to be.
Right. I think that's just a hugely important point. We get into this mindset, I think, of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If we don't know about it, what you don't see can't hurt you. And, that's what Mike's alluding to here is it not only does it hurt you, it can hurt you in extremely significant ways. So let's dig into some of these blind spots. And guys, if we don't get through them all today, we're going to make sure at the end of the show notes, you can just click a link and download a free guide, and it will have the 10 blind spots for you and a much more in-depth analysis of what they are. But today we want to cover them and just cover the highlights of what they are. One of the first ones is this idea of certainty. So I'm going to let Mike take this. He's got some really interesting concepts about why certainty can be such a huge blind spot.
Yeah, and you're right. I'm glad that you mentioned that we're not even going to begin to really dive into these as deeply as they deserve. I mean, certainty is such a big topic. I think we can all agree that there seems to be some issues as a profession as far as self-esteem goes, especially, I mean, in relation to, the medical profession and the accepted traditional health routes that we have,
Right.
in especially around the world. And so I think definitely, this starts with self-esteem. But, I think, my observation has been that, I've heard some chiropractors with some ridiculously big practices say some absolutely ridiculous things. And I always can't help but ask myself, how have they built these just enormous practices, and how are they so successful? And yet, some of the things that they're saying just make absolutely no sense to me. And as a consumer, if I was in front of them, I would just be like, are you kidding? That makes no sense. And, what I've come to the conclusion of is that it really comes down to their certainty. It's because it's not necessarily what they say, although, of course, there's, things that we could say that would, get much better results. But really it comes down to their certainty and their confidence in sharing that information, and the confidence with which they hold themselves. That's what really it's all about. And I think if you could then combine certainty with the correct actions, with the proper communication strategies, that's really where you're going to maximize your potential.
Yeah, I think, and this is such a huge blind spot, because I think you could have the other 9 areas corrected. And as you alluded to, if the certainty is damaged or the certainty is deficient, it's just going to, really decimate the impact of all the other things actually being right. And in reverse, oddly enough, you could have all the other things wrong, but with enough certainty, you would see some results. Now, the ultimate is combining the two, and that leads into number 2, which is communication. I think every chiropractor recognizes that you need to communicate. But when I'm saying communication may be a blind spot, I'm speaking more specific to the type of communication. So, in Life by Design, we're talking a lot about this third paradigm chiropractic practice, where we're teaching people this concept of getting checked for vertebral subluxation and corrected when necessary as it relates to improving their health, their body's functionality. Not to say we don't have people with symptoms or collateral damage, but, we're focused on the core problem at their spine and nervous system. Here's the deal. Do you have a way to communicate that? Do you have a way to do it in a system that's consumable for people? We have this, way of just pouring, quote unquote, education down the throats of the people who come into our practice, talking about BJ and DD and innate intelligence, all these things that don't matter. And if anything, they derail your sales process and really become a distraction to get them moving in the direction that you want. So, do you have a curriculum? Do you have a set series of concepts and ideas that are built around your bigger idea that leads them specifically to an end goal? So that could be a massive blind spot. So let's say you have the certainty and you're a great communicator and you have this great model down, and now somebody walks into your practice and it doesn't look like you think it should look. This is, what we consider the VIP experience. And Mike's a pro in this, and this is something he's really taught me. So, Mike, why is the experience so important, and why is it such a big blind spot for so many offices?
Well, I think we need to realize that people are more than ever willing to buy an experience, and they're willing to pay more for an experience. Of course, Apple products probably being the best example of that, versus just, searching for commodities, searching for the lowest price. And, I think the biggest blind spot around this is, really, maybe first chiropractors not recognizing what their core values are. So what is their brand? What does it represent? And then just as important is also understanding, and the blind spot is not understanding who they're selling to. Who is your avatar in marketing speak? Knowing the people that you're actually delivering a service and you're asking to exchange value for is just so crucially important. And so, the reality is every detail matters in your practice. And so mapping out that entire process in a consistent way to your values, to your brand, and to your avatar from, the first day they step in your practice to, hopefully the end of their lives, assuming that we're all working toward lifetime care, it's just critical. I mean, everything matters. Every little detail matters. And, I think for any of I'm sending out an invitation here. I hope you're okay with this. But I think, the Life by Design Center, this new, just unbelievable facility that you've created, if you want to see how to do this right, how, just to see, walk through your new facility and just to see that you've taken care of every single little detail. I think if people out there are around Blenheim, Ontario, they need to stop by and see it, because I think you've done just a magical job of it, because you can actually just as I walk through it, I can imagine and sense the emotions and just the experience that people are having, and I guarantee that's going to make just an enormous difference in not only the results that your practice members and your community are going to have in your practice, but also too just in their willingness to share it with others, to speak highly of. I mean, just everything. You've taken care of everything, and so I can't express enough how important the experience is. And the good news is that more than ever, people are willing to buy and pay for an experience.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Thanks for saying that. And of course, the invitation is definitely open. And of course, why wouldn't you be in the Blenheim, Ontario area? I mean, if you're not, you're missing out, of course. And you're right. I mean, I was just going to chime in and kind of share a case study in the sense that this is happening in my own practice, and it's something that Mike has helped me with, and we've worked on, and creating that here in the new Life by Design Center has been extremely valuable. And aside from the systems and great communication, all the other things we have in place, I can say, in an 8-month period, growing the practice 100 visits a week of people paying regular fees. We're not talking about discounted care for everybody walking through the door. I think the VIP experience has been maybe the most important piece of the puzzle. And people comment regularly. They walk in, they realize that this is a really high-end place, and it elevates in their mind the value of the experience, and they're willing to pay for that. So it leads us to the next blind spot, Mike, which is marketing. This is probably a 20 podcast series, and something that we're passionate about, Life by Design. So you're going to hear a lot about this on the Life by Design for Chiropractors podcast regularly, but just in a very, very small nutshell, if you can talk about why marketing is such a blind spot, especially for chiropractors.
Yeah, to be very specific, I think the biggest problem is that most chiropractors look at marketing as just getting warm bodies in the practice. So there's no differentiation between different people that come in for their initial consult or begin to even entertain the idea of becoming a practice member in your practice. And so I think that is the most critical thing is, the blind spot is that we don't understand that not all warm bodies, new people in our office are actually, equally as valuable, that they are very different. And that really, starting to understand, again, back to that avatar, who is your ideal practice member, what do they look like, and then trying to figure out how you can create a marketing process that can actually speak directly to them. It's going to actually, hopefully push people who are not your avatar away and attract more and more of those people who are your ideal practice members, because that is, I think one of the biggest things that we see around chiropractic practices is this problem with conversion and retention.
Right.
Well, is it really a conversion and retention problem, or is it more of a marketing problem where you've actually attracted the wrong people to your practice? And so, again, we could go down a whole rabbit hole with this, but I think the big takeaway, or the thing I want people to think about, is that, who are you attracting into your practice? Start really giving some thought to what is the quality around the new people that you're bringing in, because I think you can all agree that the amount of time and energy that it takes to process 100 new people, and say you're only converting a percentage of those. If you could just learn how to really market to your avatar, to those ideal practice members, and just focus all of your time and energy on that small group who are going to stay and convert, that is going to be a far better use of your time and resources.
Yeah, totally agree, 100%. We'll dig into this, Mike, more and more, and obviously you'll be back on the show on a regular basis, and I think this can be a topic we really get into. And more importantly, one of the things we're really excited about is creating some tools for you guys to actually be able to use and work through some of these experiments yourself, so you can get the results and actually see that, when you uncover this blind spot and work through it, it can yield extremely big dividends. The next blind spot's the examination. This is just one of those things that, I ask the question often with clients, are you doing an examination, as a show, or are you clinically examining the spine and nervous system to determine if there's a core problem. Is there really a subluxation? And is that subluxation affecting this person's physiology in a way? Do you use the examination to determine your care process? These are things that I think are really important, and having a quality examination that's based on objectivity, really, it's going to boost your acceptance rates. It's going to boost the conversion of people into your practice because they recognize the quality of the examination and the performance that goes into that examination, the knowledge, the expertise. And so when you give a recommendation, what's happening is you're saying, here's what we objectively see and interpret. And so in order to get, this goal you've set out to get, we're going to have to correct this problem that we can see the effects of right here versus something that's more subjective or done just as show. The next blind spot is agreements. You have this examination, you see what you need to see, you give a very clear recommendation as to what needs to happen. And a lot of times, if you pay attention to this, and this is what I want you to look at this week in your practice, are you getting a very clear agreement? This is such an important piece of the practice puzzle. In any sales process, you have to get an agreement. I think a lot of chiropractors, what they do is they rely on unclear agreements because they're just not willing to have that conversation with people. It's so much easier in that moment to avoid the stress of asking for an agreement, whether that's a self-esteem issue. It doesn't matter, but what's going to happen is it's going to come back to bite you later. It's not doing you any good. It's only doing you harm. So it's going to lead to major problems. It's going to actually lead to more stress, not less. And if anything, it's going to lead to less certainty because you won't, you say to yourself, man, I'm getting all these great conversions at the second day. But what's happening is these people are disappearing from my practice as time goes on. And that's because you didn't take the time to get a clear agreement. And it can be very, very simple. It can be, is this important enough to you to take the next 16 weeks to begin to correct this core problem with your spine and maximize your nervous system and start to optimize your health? And they say, yes. You say, great. You're 100% sure. Yes, perfect. Great. So here's what we're going to need to do. Just that agreement alone could totally transform your practice. The seventh blind spot that we want you to pay attention to and look into is financials. Mike, you really for Life by Design are the business guru and the director of daily operations. Talk a bit about financials and what people miss in practice with this whole financial model. I mean, I've seen some pretty crazy ones.
Yeah, I think the blind spots as I think of finances, the first one, of course, comes back to number one and the certainty and confidence. No matter how perfect the financials are set up, if you're not certain and confident, then it's going to come across and the results will speak for themselves. I think another big one in looking across, so many different chiropractors over the years have sent me their financials and the way they set it up and the offerings they have. And I find the majority of the time they're very confusing. And I think oftentimes that leads to this, sounding a little bit salesy. So I think, having a very confusing and not simple financial, care plans or whatever those type of things that you're offering in your office. Just, the lack of simplicity, I think, is a big one. I think, you just hit on a big one is, financials, should not even be discussed until there's a very clear agreement, that about, what is going to happen. I think that's another critical one. And then if I could, maybe just add one more, I think really, you've really got to get this mindset that you're not actually buying or you're not selling visits, they're not buying visits, that you're actually buying a program or a process. Right. I think that's a really critical thing that I think that we need to keep in the back of our minds, and I think that we need to consider when actually, creating these financial options that we have for our practice members.
Yeah, I totally agree. This idea of, and this is actually something I picked up from you, was, buying a result, right? And when you shift your mindset, and I know at least in Canada, we have to map out a per visit fee and have it broken down that way. So, from a demonstration standpoint or a presentation standpoint, yes, we're breaking it down, but we make it very clear that, people are buying a process. In our practice, the Life by Design chiropractic method, they're buying that and the results that comes along with it. So, for yourself in your practice, just take a look at your financial systems and, in order to determine if it's a blind spot or not, present it to somebody who maybe isn't a practice member, maybe to your spouse, to a friend, and see if they actually understand what the heck it's trying to demonstrate. That would be step one, and then you could simplify it from there. Number 8 is feedback. And first question is, are you giving feedback? Now, I don't just mean visit to visit. I'm finding this subluxation at C2, great correction, perfect. Okay, that test is showing everything is structurally balanced. Good, great job. But are you having consistent feedback in terms of a feedback cycle? So a progress examination, re-examinations, going back to your objective findings. So often, drives me nuts. So often we'll see people get transferred in from another office and they'll have had tests. And then I ask them, so what did your next set of tests look like? And they never had the next set of tests. And it irks me and drives me crazy because, the question is, why were those tests done in the first place? Were they done as simply an education process to drive the sales process, or were they used in your clinical process? And from a straight up business perspective, using those objective findings again is beneficial. You don't need to be scared of what those tests are going to show, especially if you're delivering great care. We should be held, in somewhat, at least partially responsible for the results that people get, at least in terms of subluxation correction. Obviously, there's some other things that people need to do to be a part of the process, but are you re-examining people and are you having conversations about those re-exams? And here's the key to go back to one of our previous blind spots. Are you getting new agreements? That's such an important point. It's an opportunity. It's not something to be scared of. It's an amazing opportunity to get a new agreement and then go forward again. And you can repeat that cycle over and over again and actually use that to grow your practice instead of actually seeing it as an opportunity for people to drop out of your practice. Mike, number 9, expenses. Are people paying too much? What is it when it comes to blind spots? What do people need to be aware of in terms of their expenses? And I'm notorious for this one, especially with the new center. I kind of look in the bank account and part of it is, I know what I'm trying to accomplish in my vision. And through the building phase, I probably didn't keep as close an eye on my expenses as I needed to because I'd already made that commitment. I was just going to get it done. And I know that would probably drive you crazy that I did it that way. But, how does this play out in most chiropractic practices?
Well, I think it really comes down to not knowing the cost per patient or per practice member, not knowing how much it costs you to actually deliver a check and adjustment. You need to know that. And if you do not know that, you are in trouble. That is a massive, massive blind spot because I've seen so many chiropractors when they actually did that calculation, they figured out how much it cost. What they find out is that they're actually paying people to adjust them, and that's not okay. It's not okay. You are not people's bank. Yes, chiropractic is life altering. No, you are not a servant. You need to make a profit. You are a business. And when you make a profit, what that allows you to do, not only to fund, your life and your values, but it also allows you to reinvest in your business, in your practice, so that you can actually reach out and help even more people. So, making a profit is critical to any business. That is its lifeline, of course. So knowing your cost per patient and really understanding what your margin is a critical thing for any business, especially a chiropractor. And if we don't know that, that is really going to, at some point, it's got to come back and bite you.
10 blind spots, Mike. There they are. Oh, actually, there's one more, Mike. Let me talk about the 10th one. I was getting ahead of myself there. The big one, the retention one. This is the one where all these other ones lead to, this final piece of the puzzle. And that's, what we're trying to build here is this long-term retention-based practice. We just did LifeCon 15, which is our live event, and covered how to build a retention-based practice. And this is one of those things that, we just see the cycle of new people coming in, and they're not staying. So how do you know if this is a blind spot? Well, if you have 15, 20 new people every single month and your practice isn't growing in size and it's staying the same, I think you have a problem. If you go down to your file room and you see, 3,000 files that are in the inactive box, I think you have a major, major problem. And it's just so much easier to have a practice where people stay. And I know that everybody wants that, and it's seen as the elusive thing in practice, in chiropractic practice, but it's not. And we've built a retention-based practice. And when I say that, I mean statistically built one, because I'll meet with people and I'll have these consulting calls and I'll say, do you have a retention-based practice? And they say yes. And then I send them a tool to use to calculate, different statistics and all the very key metrics for their practice, one of them being retention, and they don't have a retention-based practice. And it becomes a huge shocker for them to realize that maybe things aren't what they think that they are. So, how do you know which blind spots you have? number one, you need to know this because it's going to stop you from jumping around, right? I mean, we're notorious for chasing the shiny penny and, just doing whatever it is to get the next set of new people to come in. And that's extremely stressful. It's not profitable. It's majorly energy consuming. So here's what you need to do as we bring today's show to a close. You need to figure out what the most important metrics of your practice are, and you need to measure them. And there's lots of tools out there. Different practice management groups have them. So if you have one, wonderful, use that. If not, check out the SSS, Success Surveillance System. It's killer. It works incredible. It's what we use in our practices. And then systematize entering the information and keep track. You can't just in your mind say, I have a retention-based practice or I have great conversion. That tells me nothing. And, I might like you, but I'm not going to believe you until I see your actual statistics. So take the time to get that entered because that's where all the good stuff is going to happen. So today we talked about the 10 blind spots. Head over to the show notes page at lifebydesignforchiropractors.com/podcast. Find today's episode and you can download that for free. Just go check that out and then you'll have that as a PDF. Much more in-depth into each of these areas. And then next, start to figure it out, right? Every time you listen to a show, our real goal and intention here is that you take some action. And I'm going to just repeat it. It's going to be a mantra that's a huge part of the podcast. You have to get it done. You have to get to work and start to take these steps. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen. And we're just going to be a podcast that you listen to every couple of weeks. And, you'll feel good about it, but you're not going to get that end result, which is really what we want. We want to have the success stories. We want to hear from you. We want to hear all the great changes and benefit and results that you're getting from implementing many of the things on the show. If you have questions, just on the show notes page, go in, leave some questions, send us comments, go to iTunes would really help since it's a new podcast, and leave a review would be wonderful, and leave a ranking there for us. That'd be great. So everything you need is going to be at the show notes page, lifebydesignforchiropractors.com/podcast. Thank you for listening to Life by Design for Chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic.